you're well, and I also hope that you are having a good day so far. Today, we'll be doing our grade 5 English lesson on sensory details. So, we'll be doing our grade 5 English lesson on sensory details. And before we start with our lesson, we're going to log into aplusstudents.ca. Once we've logged on to aplusstudents.ca with our username as well as our password, and then we're going to select the subject of language arts. Grade 5. And then we're going to scroll down up until we get to the chapter of sensory details. All right. All right. So our chapter is sensory details. Our subject is English language arts. Grade 5. And the lessons that we're going to be focusing on is to identify sensory details. All right, so when it comes to sensory details, right, and then you basically have to think of your senses, right? So we have like 5 senses. So we have 5 senses, and our senses are it's basically to see, which is like sight. It is to hear, which is like sound, right? Because you hear sounds. It is like it is to smell, right? It's like the sense that you smell. It's to taste, and it's to touch, right? So that is basically our 5 senses that we have. So when it comes to sensory details, right, then it's basically to do with how we are aware of our senses, right? Whether it's around us, how we need to imagine it in order to make sense of it, or basically for it to make it more, let's say, easier for us. So when it comes to sensory details, right? So writers, they use sensory details to make stories and scenes easier for readers to imagine. So it's like if they, let's say, like kind of show some form of dramatic way or expression, right? based on our senses, then it makes it more easy for you as a reader to imagine that something is happening, or for you to imagine that, um, you know, when it comes to our senses, that the specific thing or the action is actually happening. A sensory detail, right? It makes the reader imagine a particular sight, it makes the reader imagine a particular sound, it makes the reader imagine a particular smell, taste, or even touch, right? So it makes the reader imagine that. And if you can think of one example, right? If we think of examples like if you watch cartoons, right? Remember, if you are watching something on television, you cannot smell what's whatever that they are, maybe, let's say if they are baking something, right? So what do you what is the let's say the story writers usually do when it comes to, like, let's say, to portray as maybe a scent? They would, for example, show like a cloud, almost like, let's say, like almost like a cloud, a scent cloud that would basically, or like an aroma that will basically be filling the air, right? So if it's a very nice baking smell or perfume smell, that it would be like a light grayish cloud that will be going up in the air, and you'll be able to smell it, and you look at the expression of the character, that will basically make it seem as if the scent is a beautiful scent that smells lovely, right? Whether it's a food smell or perfume smell, for example. And even if it is a smell that is not so nice, let's say a very bad garbage smell, or it is a smell that is just not nice, then what do? They do is they usually show like this greenish cloud, you understand? Which gives us the idea that this greenish scent, let's say this cloud, is associated with a scent or smell that is not nice. And they'll even look at the expression of the character to show that the smell is not nice. You understand? So basically, what we do is we as readers, we imagine, right? Based on what we see, that this is something nice, this is not something nice, right? We even imagine based on what we see on television, or we see wherever, right? Because either readers, let's say either writers, they want you to imagine certain things when you're reading, or producers or story writers also want you to imagine certain things when you are watching something, right? And how do we imagine things? We imagine things either by using our senses, right? When you are reading, you are using your imagination, right? To basically imagine something that you can see, imagine sound that you hear based on the wording that they use within a specific text to maybe show a sign, to basically show sound, right? To give you an explanation or description of scent or smell, right? They would describe the taste of something, and you would imagine how it tastes based on how it is being explained, right? You won't be able to touch it, but based on your imagination and based on the description that is given, you imagine how you can touch something, and basically how you see something. So basically, the writers, right, or story writers, they use sensory details to make stories and scenes easier for the reader to imagine. Because remember, most of the books, especially like your age books, right, it is basically books that are not true, right? It is basically made up books. But what is more interesting about the books is the fact that it basically wants you to imagine, it wants you to use your imagination, right? It wants you to have a good laugh, right? If there's pictures in the book, then it's like they want you to try to put words to the pictures, right? So that is basically how we are able to use our senses and how we can even identify our senses. And that is why the lesson that we're focusing on is to identify sensory details. All right. So when it comes to our sensory details, right, or our senses, we said that we have five senses, which is sight, it's sound, it is smell, it is taste, and touch, right? That is our five senses or our sensory details that we have. If we look at the first one, which is sight, right? John's face glowed from the light of the fire. And if you can see, based on the description, right, that is given, how can you not imagine when you read something or you watch something? How can you not imagine the glowing on the face from the light of the fire, right? Because now it says John's face, it glowed from the light of the fire. So now you're picturing John either being close to a fire and the face basically like glowing because of this reddish orange light that is basically shining on his face based, which is basically from the fire. Then we have sound, right? And the central details of sound is in the morning, Samantha awoke to the chirping of birds outside her window. Remember, when it comes to stories, right? You don't directly hear the chirping of birds, right? It is a description that is given in a book, in a story, right? So, which means that we now need to lock our imagination to us trying to make sense of the fact that we are hearing birds chirping early in the morning. Then we have smell, right? It's our scent. I caught a whiff of freshly baked bread as I passed by the bakery and your mouth is watering. Actually, or if you're watching something, then they will basically show and it's literally going here by your nose, right? And then we have taste. And the sharply sour apple made Mary's mouth pucker. So the sharply sour apple made Mary's mouth pucker. All right. which means that this description is giving the idea that there is a sharply sour apple, right? And how does a face usually turn when something is sour? Especially if they're describing it as being sharply sour, right? It's like you already picture how you are pulling your face if you were to eat this sharply sour apple, right? And then we also have touch. Ted was uncomfortable in his scratchy wool sweater. So Ted was uncomfortable with his scratchy wool sweater. And if the reader says that somebody was uncomfortable in his scratchy wool sweater, now you must know that that person does not like the sweater. Maybe they like the sweater, but now it's giving them an irritation of they're constantly itching and they are scratching, right? And if you look at the description of the sweater, it is also a wool sweater. Not just any wool, but it is a scratchy wool sweater, meaning that you are itching all the time, probably because of the material of the sweater. So this is basically our five senses that we had made mention of, which is sight, which is sound, smell, taste, and touch. So sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. And that is basically our five senses. And during the course of the lesson, we are going to identify how we can basically identify sensory details within a sentence. And we can identify sensory details within a sentence based on the wording of a sentence, based on the description of a sentence, right? Because that description needs to make you as a reader imagine something that you can see, something that you can hear, something that you can smell, taste, or even touch. All right. And we are doing our tutorial lesson on A plus students.ca. So we are doing our tutorial lesson on A plus students.ca. All right. So now let's go to A plus students.ca. All right. And we said our chapter is sensory details, and the lesson that we are focusing on is to identify sensory details. All right. Right, and we said that we have basically our five senses, and we said that writers, they want to use sensory details to make stories and senses more easier for us as readers to imagine, right? And the sensory details make the reader imagine a particular sight, something that they can see, a particular sound, a particular smell, a particular taste, or even a particular touch, right? So the writers, they want you to imagine that. And we said when it comes to sight, all right, The specific details that is given, right, makes it more easy for us to identify certain sensory details. And we see it when it comes to sight. Then an example that is given is, for example, or certain details that is given is where they say John's face glowed from the light of the fire. So basically, they're telling you that the face, John's face, it glowed. Glowed from what? From the light of the fire. So now this is now you trying to imagine, right, this specific glow on his face from the light of the fire. We said with sound, right? In the morning, Samantha awoke to the chirping of birds outside her window. And then we have smell, right? I caught a whiff of freshly baked bread as I passed by the bakery. So, where did you smell it? As I was passing by the bakery. And then we have taste. The sharply the sharply sour apple made Mary's mouth pucker. So which means that we are talking about the sharply sour apple, right? Meaning that I can even picture or imagine someone's face being pulled because of how the sharply sour apple taste that you're tasting. It's like you're pulling your mouth and your tongue, and it's like putting the tongue out because of how sour something is. And then Ted was uncomfortable with his scratchy, woolly sweater, which means that he's constantly pulling it away from his skin because this sweater is making him scratch or itch. So, as much as the sweater can maybe be beautiful, but it is making him scratch and itch. So, basically, how we can identify sensory details? We can identify it based on matching, for example, the sight word with the description that is given. All right, let's go to an activity. So we're going to select the sentence which a sensory detail with a sensory detail that describes a smell. So we're going to select a sensory detail that describes a smell, something that you can smell. All right, whether it is in your imagination, but we are going to try and imagine the smell based on the description that is given. It says after the basketball game, Troy headed to the locker room. He wrinkled his nose at the sweaty stench that greeted him. So after the basketball game, Troy headed to the locker room. He wrinkled his nose at the sweaty stench that greeted him. Right now, he wanted to shower, change his clothes, and go home. But as usual, coach wanted to have a team talk about the game. Troy sighed and pulled on his sweatshirt. At least they had won tonight. So it would be a happy team talk. All right. So if we're going to select the sentence with a sensory detail that describes a smell, and then the sentence is he wrinkled his nose at the sweaty stench that greeted him. So he wrinkled his nose at the sweaty stench that greeted him. So that is basically the sentence with a sensory detail that describes a specific smell. Because within that sentence, they're basically still giving us a description of the smell as well as what it can smell. All right. And that is basically how we can select and identify a specific sentence. So we said that the sentence with the sensory details about smell or that describes a smell is he wrinkled his nose at the sweaty stench that greeted him. It's almost like it's like you're trying to smell and trying to imagine the smell, but like your nose is kind of lifted because you're trying to make sense of the smell, right? All right. So which means that when it comes to that sentence, right, that describes a smell, the details, right, or the detail which is sweaty. Because remember in the sentence that was identified was he wrinkled his nose at the sweaty stench that greeted him. All right, so basically, if we look at the details, which is sweaty or the sweaty stench, and then we can say the detailed sweaty stench is something the reader can imagine smelling. All right. Now it says that we need to select the sentence with the sensory detail that describes taste. right? That describes something that you can taste. Steam won the 200-meter race with a burst of speed at the finish. He was he was the new state champion. As Steve as Steve caught his breath, his coach and teammates had rushed over to congratulate him. Everyone was cheering. Steve had never been happier or hungrier. And to celebrate, Steve's parents took him to his favorite restaurant. His meal his meal came with the best tangy barbecue sauce that he had ever had. So, which means that if we look at this specific sentence, right, and we select the sentence with a sensory detail that describes taste, and then we're going with the underlined sentence where taste is being described. It's like they're first giving us a description of everything else before we get to the then they went to a restaurant. All right. And if we look at the details that was given, right, it says his meal came with the best tangy barbecue sauce that he had ever had. So it's like we can already try and imagine or picture the mouth drooling, right? Because his burger was the best tangy burger sauce, with the best tangy burger sauce. And it was dinner fit for a champion. All right. And if we select the sentence with sensory details that describe taste, and then we will specifically say his meal came with the best tangy barbecue sauce that I've ever had. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily tasting it, right? But remember, we said that the reader wants you to imagine, right? So you need to imagination a smell. You need to imagine a taste. You need to imagine touch. All right. All right. Remember, we said that when it comes to sensory details, then the writers they use these sensory details to make stories and scenes easier for the reader to imagine. Right? And in this case, so we said when it comes to the taste that is being described, and then we said that his meal came with the best tangy barbecue sauce. All right. So now we're going to our test, right? Where we're going to identify sensory details. And remember, we said sensory details is to do with our sight, our hearing, our taste, smell, and did I say touch? Touch, hear, smell, hear, and our taste. All right, so now we're going to identify sensory details within the sentence that is given. And we're going to select the sentence with a sensory detail that describes how something feels to the touch. All right. So now we're going to select the sentence with a sensory detail that describes how something feels to the touch. My brother Zane works at the petting zoo. That's where little kids can go if they want to pet some animals. The zoo operator put only the gentlest animals in that section of the zoo. I asked Zane which of the animals is his favorite. He said that he likes the baby llama because he likes to stroke her soft, silky fur. I think I like the baby duckling the best. So we now need to select the sentence with a sensory detail that describes how something feels to touch. Is it the first option, which is line one, which is my brother Zane works at the petting zoo? Is it soft, silky fur? That is how it feels. Imagining it. All right. Yes. And if we are going to select a sentence with the sensory details that describes how something feels to the touch, then something feels soft and something feels silky, right? And I must know usually fur is soft and silky, right? And well done, soft, silky fur, right? We need to select the sentence with a sensory detail that describes how something feels to the touch. All right. It says, it was getting late as Henry walked down the street. He felt a cold shiver ran down his spine. Was somebody following him, or was that his imagination again? Just then, his brother Bruce ran up. Bruce explained that everyone was waiting for Henry to get home for dinner. All right. So, if we were to describe how something feels to the touch based on the sentences, and then we will go with the sentence, he felt cold shivers run down his spine. He felt. And if we select then we will say cold shivers. So cold shivers. And cold shivers is correct. We need to select the sentence with a sensory detail that describes a sound, something that you can hear. So we need to give details that describes a sound. It says Rosa pulled on her cap and climbed onto the tractor, ready to plow a vegetable garden. She turned the switch and heard the engine grinding and whining, but it wouldn't start. Rosa went into the barn to get her horses to pull the plow. She'd rather work with the horses anyway. All right. And if we describe the sound, and then we will go with engine grinding and whining. So now it's almost like you can already picture like, this tractor want to start, which means that now I get the sound or the idea of the sound, which is engine grinding and whining. So if we describe a sound, is it engine grinding and whining or work with her horses? So let's go with the first one, engine grinding and whining. And that is totally correct. And if we describe the smell, do we say it is a sweaty? Oh, we didn't even read it yet. We said after the basketball game, Troy headed to the locker room. He wrinkled his nose at the sweaty stench that greeted him. Right now, he wanted to shower, change his clothes, and go home. But as usual, Coach wanted to have a team talk about the game. Troy sighed and pulled on his sweat shirt. At least they had won tonight, so it was a happy team. And if we select the sensory details that describe the smell, we can say it is sweaty stench. And well done. Sweaty stench is correct. So that is basically how we identify sensory details, right? And we said sensory details is to do with our five senses, how we hear something, how we see something, right? How we touch something, smell and taste, right? And the details that is given, right? It's because the reader wants us to, the writer wants us to imagine how something tastes, smell, and so on based on our senses. All right, so this is now the end of our lesson on sensory details. Thank you very much, Grade 5, for joining our class. Till next time, have a good evening further. Goodbye.